G'day and welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube for part 2 of this 4-part off-season series on players to watch in 2026. I'm Damo, and today I'll be discussing the emerging talent on our list that I expect to have a bigger impact in 2026 by way of improvement. So unlike part 1 of the series, which covered new draftees, part 2 will include players who are already at West Coast. So just to set the ground rules, the purpose of every episode is to compare the improvement that each player will bring to the side compared to the year just gone. So when you see top tier players further down the list, the natural explanation for this is going to be that their impact in 2026 may not be significantly more than what they contributed this year, while a player that's on the fringe has a lot more room to improve their output, which is where I'm predicting that the guys on this list will be making a bigger impact. I'm sure you'll start to get a feel for that logic as we go through these lists. Part 1, by the way, new draftees is already out if you haven't already had a chance to watch. And then after this video, part 3, we'll discuss senior inclusions to the club, both from the trade period and SSP, who are best placed to have an immediate impact on our best 23 before finally, part 4 will predict senior resurgence from established West Coast players that will either be returning from injury or just a slump in form that's predicted to pass. Before I give a final verdict on the overall impact of all 4 lists, which will include a final combined ranking of the players from different lists and how they stack up on the final master list, really. But before we get going with part 2, I'm going to make my own personal appeal to anybody watching these videos who isn't a subscriber to please consider hitting that subscribe button and helping make this channel and all the content produced on it sustainable long term. I've noticed a great deal of growth from an entirely new audience since the AFL season finished, and I'm happy to let you all know that throughout the season I do provide reviews of not just the AFL games, but also our waffle side, which I think includes, just by track record, pretty reliable information on who's going well and who's close to pushing their way into the AFL squad on a week-to-week basis. The trade, draft, and off-season content that you're watching right now is designed just to keep the content rolling all year round. So if you do hit that button, you can be sure to never go too long without getting your West Coast fix. And speaking of getting that fix, let's take a look at our list for today. And in the top spot for biggest impact next year through improvement, I've got Harley Reed. So after already achieving what I think is a fair thing to qualify as a breakout season in his first year, Harley did work his way through what's often referred to as some second-year blues this year in 2025. Just to give some fairness and context, he had an interrupted preseason that appeared to contribute to a slow run-up early in the year, while the added attention he received without Elliott Yeo on the side kind of just compounded that lower fitness base, where we really didn't see him exhibiting that elite athleticism and power that we're all used to. The good news for Reed and pretty much all West Coast fans in general is that the building blocks are already in place to reverse both of those factors. Reed turned up day 1 of preseason looking like a man who wants to make a statement. There's one image, it's just a frame, it's not any footage of him moving about, but it did look pretty impressive. A bit like Jimby in his first couple of seasons, he's clearly piled on the muscle. And more importantly, what I think that says is that he's hit the off-season very much focused. I've got no doubt that he would have always had a good work ethic. You can't make AFL football without that. But I also think that Harley has probably spent most of his teenage years doing it easy amongst his peers once he gets on the field. Probably got his first ever wake-up call at the top level. And given his ultra-competitive nature, I doubt he's ever going to let that happen again. The other factor here is that as a club, we spent most of the year fielding a midfield of pinch hitters, with forwards like Tyler Brockman and Liam Ryan sharing the load through the middle, with defenders like Liam Baker and inexperienced draftees like Hall and Gross. Coming into 2026, the expectation is that Reed will be surrounded by pure midfielders more often and bigger senior bodies like Devin Robertson, hopefully Elliott Yeo. I mean, Jack Graham's still going to be in there as well. But to go with a much improved selection of young mids like Elijah Hewett and Bo Allen, who I understand have been training in the midfield. Not to mention the number 1 draft pick, Willem Dersma, in the engine room also. So my prediction is that out of all the big contributors across this 4-part series, Harley Reed is still going to be the biggest difference in 2026 compared to the year just gone by. And yes, that is a little spoiler for my final verdicts list. Number 2 on my list of emerging talent is Bo Allen, who I almost think has been a little bit forgotten by everybody as we went into this off-season. He had a really bad run of luck for a guy who I know was desperate to debut early for West Coast in the pre-season before 2025 started. His initial debut was delayed by sickness, and then the opportunities didn't really come as easily after that while he was building himself back up because it was quite sickness, quite the illness from what I heard at the time. So it wasn't just 1 week off. And then what we ended up seeing from Allen in his first few games was more of a highlights reel that showcased what he's capable of and his potential rather than linear improvement. And I think mainly because his conditioning and then his general continuity in that side was constantly interrupted. You might even remember he was suspended quite softly, I thought, in another one of his later attempts to settle in our squad of 23. So he hasn't had a consistent run of games in there. What was showcased to me, though, was an insane amount of straight line power and inside mid athleticism. I know he wasn't playing in there, but that's what it's always looked like to me. He had a lot of really powerful dashes off halfback from the few games he did play. And given some of the feedback I've heard from him training in the midfield, thank you, Watcher 5580, who shared some of his notes from going to open training earlier. I'm really optimistic on Bo Allen having a breakout year, especially a lot of centre clearance moments here and there, which I think is going to be one of his specialties. I do think that with all the additional depth we have in the midfield this year, that it will be a real scrap to cement one of the permanent roles in the engine room. But if he doesn't lock that down, I still think there will be a place where he does a lot of hybrid work in the midfield and up back or up forward and also up back. He's capable of moving around the ground. So he will get a run through the midfield one way or another, even if he's not a cemented inside midfielder. And all that does is it just adds to our resilience against that injury-filled displacement factor that I was talking about with Willem Dersma and players who have that versatility. The third guy on this list, I'm actually really excited to talk about, probably more than just about anyone else, and that's Tom Gross. I'm probably going to be a little bit overstated with him in particular, so you might have to forgive some of the big predictions and the big comparisons that I'm about to make. But to everybody in the waffle this year gone by, it was actually Gross who impressed me the most. As an 18-year-old, his competitiveness as an inside mid was something really special. He hunted the ball better than experienced men from the opposition all year, often with very little depth and support in that line of the field. It's like sometimes he was the only midfielder playing, sometimes he was in there with Hall. And what stood out to me the most was how much he thrived on that physical contact while hunting the ball on the inside. So without being funny, since I know I've already thrown the Marcus Bontempelli comparisons out there for Willem Dersma, Tom Gross honestly reminded me of Zach Butters watching him pinball his way through the contest in the waffle for most of the year. Now, I'm not saying he's got the same pace and he may not be the same player, but it certainly looked like a little Zach Butters just bouncing off guys and just continuing on. So here's the part that excites me. Watching his frame at 18, even up against the senior waffle players, he had a heap of physical development that he still has ahead of him. He hasn't filled out yet, I think he might already be, and really did look like some aggressive little kid out there trying to beat up on the men. Unfortunately, I think that lack of size and muscle was a bit too much when he went up against AFL bodies during the year, but it meant that he wasn't able to put that same foot forward in the best 23 when he did get the opportunity. And he didn't really showcase what I was seeing from him in the waffle. And that purely, I think, came down to there was just too much strength and conditioning in AFL guys for him to keep it up. I fully expect that this offseason, Tom Gross will be doing a Ruben Jinby, who's my benchmark for putting on muscle after the last couple of seasons, and probably stacking on a minimum of 5 kilos in pure muscle, which will completely change how he's able to play the next time he's called up to the AFL. The best part about this is that his game isn't based around his stride and his steps, so he won't have the same trouble that I've sometimes seen in guys who struggle to adjust to having a heavier physique. There's always been one guy that I remember really clearly, Stephen Hill for Fremantle. He had a massive first year. He was in that same draft year as Daniel Rich and Nick Naitanui. And his first year, it was him and Rich that really stood out the most. Naitanui kind of, I think, overtook those guys down the track. But after his first year, he put on a lot of muscle and he never could use his run and dash the same way afterwards. So it almost ruined his career that he had so much potential, but then he just had this body that he couldn't adjust to. Some guys just can't play to their strengths when they bulk up. But Tom Gross is not going to be one of those players. So keep a very close eye out, firstly, on his growth over this summer. I think there'll be photos and footage coming out because I expect that you're going to see the difference that I'm predicting. And then what he's able to do next year, keep an eye out for when he takes that new rig out to the centre of the ground. He's probably my big prediction for a breakout season next year. Next on my list of emerging players is the guy that I had at the top of my list this time last year when I released my very first video, and that's Elijah Hewett. While he finally got a much cleaner run at consistent games this year, I think he's still got so much more upside ahead of him before he gets anywhere close to his ceiling. He still had an interrupted preseason or interrupted season, I should say, at one point in 2025 that did stall his trajectory once again. But just as importantly, he's missed so much footy since he was drafted that I actually think he's going to be one of those guys who goes to another level again when he just hits that magic number of 50 games, which should happen in 2026. I think he's in the low 30s right now, correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the injuries that have kept him out of the game have been permanently resolved, with foot surgery already being sorted out in the preseason to 2025, and he's come back from that. And it looks like his body is finally getting a chance to adjust to the AFL conditioning and loading programs without those things interrupting it and having to, I suppose, accommodate them while also training. So I'm expecting that in 2026, we'll get a chance to see him bring everything together, crack multiple games with plus 25 possessions to go alongside those X factor moments that I think everyone started to know him for, and see what he's capable of. At number 5 on this list, I've got Job Shanahan. And again, I probably need to use the reminder that I'm basing this series on players and what they're going to improve compared to 2025. So given the breakout year that we already saw for him late this year, the impact of improvement is a little slimmer than some of the guys that are higher up this list. That said, he was a first-year key forward going into his second preseason with the expectation of far less attention in that part of the ground with Jake Waterman coming back into the side. So there's going to be a lot of room for him to not only build his AFL fitness, craft and general conditioning, but he should also get the chance to capitalise just on playing off opposition teams' second or third key defenders, depending on how they decide to run the matchups each week. It's quite hard to predict what his season's going to look like, given that Shanahan's quite a classy he's got quite a classy skill set that could easily see him playing a high half forward role at times, kicking inside 50, but I don't think it would be unreasonable to say that he could easily have a 30-plus goal season in the right role up forward if he comes in and improves on an already impressive first year. And to finalise my list of emerging talent for 2026, I've got one of my favourite emerging talents that I enjoyed discussing this year, and that's Klay Hall. I actually think he won that award at the Club Awards night too, actually. Anyway, the reason he's still on my list of emerging talent after supposedly already emerging is that he really showcased his strengths this year, but also some of his weaknesses at AFL level, which is a bit rough when you're playing in a side that so desperately needs you to come in and impact in a depleted midfield when you're still so new and so young. By the way, Hall's biggest room for improvement is a reasonably fixable one, and that was his defensive running, particularly in his rundown chasing. And in general, that particular metric quite simply comes down to fitness. A bit like Harley Reed from day one of preseason, we've already been given an insight into his dedication to that this offseason, because Hall came in, I think, just a step behind Hamish Davies in their lap timing fitness test. So it's not quite the same as the 2K time trial, but it's a very similar metric that they're measuring. So for him to come in just a step behind Davis, it's a very clear step up, considering that Davis is apparently the young guy that sets the benchmark for training standards out of the new crop of draftees. So given Hall's strengths have already been showcased in his physicality, his ability to find the ball and extract it from the contest, I'm really optimistic that he'll come into 2026 a far more complete player who has developed quickly in both his strengths and his weaknesses after making the most of his opportunities so far this year. Probably the biggest question mark will be, can his improvement outstrip the improvements in general that the club's made in the midfield department? Because that's going to be really the race for him to regain his spot in the engine room, since West Coast have taken really big steps in bringing in guys and making it a much more competitive part of the ground. Either way, though, the answer is going to be win-win for West Coast fans next year. Anyway, that takes me to the end of part 2 of this 4-part series on players to watch in 2026. Next week will be part 3, senior inclusions from the trade and supplementary selection periods. So if you're subscribed to the channel, then I look forward to seeing you all again for that. As always, cheers until then.